Okay, I don't know what the hell happened because OBS would not let me stop recording. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish off the second part from part one that I uploaded. Um, I was about halfway through there. And if you missed any of it, um, you could
Out
go
of the
back and
car
check.
that it seems Larry was hit.
But there's 57 seconds remaining of it. Um, I'm gonna go ahead and let it play through. Um, I don't know what the heck happened, guys. I, did my usual reacting, commenting. Um, so, please forgive me. I have to step away for a quick moment, but I will be back. Uh, like I said, I just don't know what happened, why it wouldn't stop recording. So, yeah, this is going to be, like I said, the finale to the first one that I uploaded. So here's the remaining footage.
3 times. He then began to fire back, seemingly
And please
unfazed.
excuse me.
However, many believe that this was the killing blow. And not for the round that Larry took, he was only shot in his hand and seemed to be okay. I mean, his left arm was down anyway. But because of the round that hit his gun. Again, Larry was using an HK91, and for YouTube, this is airsoft or something. The furniture's different, but the operation of this one's the same. The HK91 has a short mag well that you load your magazines into so that they can feed rounds into the gun. In a rather bizarre malfunction, his gun was shot right there at the front of the mag well. This created a sort of divot in the gun itself so that the magazine became trapped inside of it. So he couldn't get the old magazine out when he needed to reload, and he certainly couldn't put a new one in. Again, some consider this to be the kill shot because it causes Larry to do what he does next. Larry then ditches his gun in the back of the car and pulls out a now third and previously unused AK. I think he was already mentally planning to switch over to this one, hence him laying out the AK mags. But this was a problem as his AK kept jamming. Now, my theory behind this setup, and this just makes the most sense watching the whole thing to me. These guys had illegally converted all their guns, except again for the HK and the Beretta that were still semi-automatic. To convert these guns, which I am not going to explain on the internet because I like not being in jail, but it requires some level of cutting and sawing on the internals of the gun itself. Because these guys were familiar with the firearms, I think Larry knew that that AK was defective. Because think about it, he had used an AK initially in the robbery, and then he took all the time to take off all that gear and then put on all of the HK91 gear, only to then take all of that off and then put on the AK again. It seems like he really didn't want to use that AK for some reason. Now the solution to this would be, why didn't he just use the original AK that didn't have any problems, but all of the AKs were loaded with these big drum mags, so maybe mentally it just seemed easier to grab the AK and start shooting. I don't know, just a thought. Either way, it seems his gun kept jamming. He would fire a burst of rounds, then have to clear it and continue. It also didn't help that, at least inferring by the footage, he was shot in the left forearm again and was now leaning on the side of the car. With all of this happening at once, Emil really wanted to leave that north parking lot. Eventually, he leans over to the passenger side and pushes open the door for Larry to get in, but Larry, determined to do whatever he's about to do, slams the door shut and remains outside. So now, Emil is driving the car with 2 flat tires as Larry uses it for rolling cover and continues firing. While still firing and possibly communicating something to Emil, they get to the exit of the north lot and Larry makes a bound for cover to his east. There was a large tractor trailer parked there, which actually was only parked there because a neighbor had complained about its previous position the night before. While still being shot at, Larry runs to one side of the tractor trailer for cover, while Emil drives around it to the other side. It seems that the two lost sight of each other here. Emil starts to slowly gas the car as if he's waiting for Larry to come out on the other end, and Larry starts looking back and forth on either side of the truck to see where Emil is. It was during these few seconds that an officer had looped around to Emil's side of the tractor trailer and began shooting at him in the vehicle. Emil panicked and gassed the car, and in the video you can see the car hit the curb and then correct itself. But it now meant that Larry was completely alone and without cover. While standing and supposedly looking for Emil, Larry got shot twice in the back, one of the rounds hitting his subclavian artery. It's very possible here, with that shot being the first shot that would have given a lot of blood and pain, that Larry started to panic. Because while returning fire from behind the trailer, his gun jammed again, and this time he made it way worse. See, Larry's gun had experienced something commonly called a stovepipe. In other words, one of the casings that was supposed to come out of the gun instead stayed inside the gun. On the inside of the AK, there's this little rail that runs along the left side of the firearm. One of the casings had become stuck underneath this rail. Now normally, if he was thinking straight, which it seems earlier he was as he had cleared like 3 of these jams, all you would have to do is remove the magazine, the casing would drop out, you put the magazine back in, and you're good to go. But Larry, seemingly in a panic, grabbed the bolt and started racking it down, which as you can see, runs in that area where the casing was stuck and makes it dig further down in the gun. And he just started racking that thing over and over and essentially broke the gun. In order to fix what he did, it would take an entire field disassembly, which he did not have the time for. This is why many say the shot to the HK earlier sealed his fate, because it caused him to get a faulty gun, which he then made much worse in frustration. That and the shot to his subclavian artery, which would have gave him realistically about 30 minutes before he bled out. Seeing nowhere else to go, Larry crawled underneath the tractor trailer. Shortly after Larry had crawled under the truck, a cop car came up that was chasing Emil's vehicle. However, the driver looked towards the tractor trailer and saw Larry hiding underneath it. So they quickly got out of the car, shot towards Larry, and probably hit him another 2 times. I think it was during this time Larry really put together that this wasn't going to end well. He went from his very tactful and straightforward idea to a much more sloppy, casual walk. He drew his handgun from his shoulder holster and began firing it one-handed at the police. In his left hand, for some reason, he was holding an HK magazine as if he was going to make it back up the road to the car and get the gun back out. It's possible at this moment that the lack of adrenaline and blood loss was getting to him. He continued to exchange shots with the police until one of the police rounds hit him in the hand, causing him to drop his gun. It was at this moment, having been shot, as we're going to see, a lot, bleeding everywhere, and now being shot in both of his hands and his gun laying on the ground, that Larry decided it was over, and also that he wasn't going to jail. So Larry leaned over, picked up the gun with his injured hand, and took his own life. The police, not able to see anything from their angle, had no clue if the guy was crouching down to reload or laying down to take a shot, so they just kept shooting him as he laid on the ground. This is a darker video, I'm just now realizing, but hey, monetization, who needs it? I also have to mention this side story because it's hilarious. The house that was immediately next to, or on the corner of, where the shooting took place, had a man and his housekeeper there at the time, and the housekeeper kept trying to leave, and the man was saying, "No, you can't, there's like a gunfight going outside," and the housekeeper, who was from South America, said that he was being a wuss because this happened all the time where she's from, and he needs to quit being a baby about it. So then while the two of them are having this argument, literally like 10 feet away outside, the shootout just ended with Larry. So the police come to the door for some reason and ask if they can use one of the man's bed sheets to cover up the body of Larry. And the man was like, no. Which, understandably, imagine if a guy comes into your neighborhood and decides to turn it into Desert Storm, and the police are like, we really need to, be respectful of him. Like, no! I'm not ruining my wife's linen sheets just so he doesn't have to get some sun. I'm sure he's not complaining. So now the only person who's left is Emil. Also at the same time, SWAT had finally arrived to the scene. SWAT didn't mobilize towards the bank until the second report of an officer down. Again, as we established earlier, if SWAT arrived at every bank robbery in LA, they would have to be deployed several times a day. So now that the main gunfight was over, the SWAT officers were in cop cars just driving through the neighborhoods around the bank itself because everyone was on the hunt for Emil's car. So it was essentially a giant game of Pac-Man. Emil, who has been slowly rolling his car in intervals, then gets out of his car and looks back towards Larry. Now, at this point that he did this, Larry had been killed, although the police hadn't come up to his body yet. However, it's very possible from his position that Emil was able to see Larry lying on the ground. Emil does a quick move towards his chest in what seemingly a fist over his heart, possibly saluting his fallen friend. Larry then drives towards a vehicle and very calmly tries to steal it, but the driver of the vehicle just keeps backing away, and then maybe the funniest thing of this entire event, actually the funniest thing of the entire event, Emil tries to wave him to come back, which is so funny. Imagine you're driving and then a guy gets out of the car and he's got a rifle and a ski mask and body armor, and as you're backing away he's like, "No, I promise." It's from here that Emil does something I can only describe as car shopping. He pulls in front of one car and then stops, backs up, and keeps driving. And then he pulls in front of another car and then stops and then hits another car and then pulls away. Eventually, he sees a Jeep and decides to steal it. Hey, so I'm editing this right now and just wanted everyone to know I have no idea why I called that truck a Jeep. It's very plainly a truck and not a Jeep at all. And I'm going to continue for the rest of the video you're watching to refer to it as a Jeep for some reason. The driver of the Jeep begins to back away, but then Emil shoots through the window, breaking the glass and cutting the driver across the face. Reports are conflicting here, but the driver either pulled the key out of the ignition or hit a kill switch on the vehicle before ditching the car. Emil was not aware of this, so he pulls up next to the Jeep, begins throwing stuff into the back of it. However, whenever he gets into the driver's seat and tries to move the car, again it won't move. He supposedly bends down and tries to figure out what's keeping the car from moving, and as he's doing this, a SWAT car sees him and is able to pull up right in front of him. Emil sees this at the last moment, gets out, and then runs back around to take cover behind his own vehicle. It's from here that gunfire continues for about 2.5 minutes straight. Emil grabbed a new gun out of the truck, the previously unseen dissipator with the 100-round beta bag, and just laid over the hood of his car and kept shooting. The SWAT team who was behind their own vehicle was returning fire and getting several hits, however they kept hitting the body armor. One of the SWAT members, Officer Anderson, moved around the car in order to clear a jam, and whenever he did, realized that he could get an angle on Emil's legs. So he leaned underneath the Jeep and began firing several of the shots, hitting Emil in the uncovered legs. Emil realizes where these shots came from and begins returning fire the same way, before Officer Gomez lays down and takes a few accurate shots into Emil's arm that's now ducked under the car, and this causes Emil to drop his weapon and finally give up. Emil throws his hands in the air in order to surrender, however the police who are laid under the car continue firing and strike him in the buttocks and leg. The officers then move around to the front of the car and cuff him as he laid on his stomach. Unknowing if the guy had a bomb or other weapons on him, one of the officers aimed a gun at the back of his head to make sure he didn't try anything, and the front of the gun was so hot that it seared the impression of the flash hider into the back of his head. After this, police and news crews managed to come up and begin to get action shots of the scene, which led to this very iconic image of the arrest. The police kept asking for Emil's name, to which he gave the false alias of Pete. Another thing that had happened that I hadn't mentioned because we've been in like the, cool gunfight part of it, is that there were several false calls happening at the same time. By the end of the day, there were 17 calls from the neighborhood who saw 17 different people who they all thought was the shooter. If they saw anyone doing anything, they called 911 and said that it was another robber, to the degree that someone called the police because they said they saw someone working underneath their car. Yes, I'm sure that the robbers, as they were making a hasty getaway, decided to repair this random guy's Dodge. Because of this, the police did not know if there was another suspect that they need to be on the lookout for. They tried to ask Emil if there was another suspect, but he just kept yelling for the police to shoot him, so that wasn't really a help. So the area was still on lockdown. The police kept trying to get information from him, but he just kept saying things like, F you, kill me, I hope you die, and other pleasantries. Emil had been shot a lot, but every one of his shots was in the legs. Now, while thigh shots can definitely be fatal, it doesn't seem that he had something like a clipped femoral. However, what he did have was a bunch of barbiturates in his system. Barbiturates can also act as a blood thinner, so it's quite possible that the drug he was on caused him to bleed out a lot quicker. In a move that is very highly contested to this day, Emil laid on the ground bleeding for 56 minutes. Now, this argument has two sides. On the one hand, there were several calls coming in that another gunman was still at large, and considering how violent the shootout had been, I highly doubt these guys were going to assume that if there was a third one, he'd be in a talking mood. And also, Emil wasn't being very forthcoming, so it's understandable that they'd still be on alert. And the other side of the argument is that this guy had just shot up a bunch of police, so maybe the police that were there just weren't in a hospitable mood. So, after 56 minutes of laying on the ground, Emil died due to gunshot wounds to his legs. The area was still on lockdown and the search would still continue. However, what the police didn't know at the time was Emil's death was the end of the action that occurred that morning. The gunfight lasted 44 minutes, with some accounts saying up to 2,000 rounds were fired, with 1,100 of those rounds coming from the two shooters. This gives an estimate of about one shot every 2 seconds for the duration of the gunfight. Around 300 cops ended up responding to the scene either during the fight or afterwards, and one of the largest gunfights in LA history was nearly entirely filmed. So how many people died in this massive shootout? None. Well, excluding the two shooters, but they don't count. Now, it is true that during the whole scenario, 12 police and 8 civilians were injured, but as mentioned, no one was killed. Hi, it's me again, the editing me, not the video me. I hyped up how many shots Larry and Emil received and then forgot to say it in the video. So now I'm here to tell you that at least 11 shots made contact with Larry's skin, and probably way more hit his armor. And Emil had 29 bullet wounds in his legs. Again, more shots definitely hitting his armor. These numbers are going off of the coroner's report, which is why we don't have exact numbers for how tore up the armor was. Now that 29 figure is a little bit misleading. That's not bullet holes or bullets in him, that's bullet wounds. So if a round struck the pavement and shot 5 pieces of fragment into his leg, that would count as 5 wounds. So while not 29 individual bullets, I'm still sure he was having a terrible time. Now the events of that day carried all the way to 11:30 that night when the lockdown was finally lifted. Some parents weren't able to get their kids out of school until 8 p.m. because everyone was on high alert that someone else may be out there. And again, as mentioned earlier, this was due in part to the entire neighborhood calling 911 every time they saw a bird out of place. In a case that I still don't really know where it came from, the police, for some reason, thought that this supposed third gunman was hiding in the storage shed of this old guy's house. So the police come to his door and are like, "Sir, we have to investigate this third shooter. Can you and your bedridden wife leave for a while?" So the old man's like, "Okay, officer, I guess." So he puts his little wife in a wheelchair and puts a blanket over her because it was February and it was cold. So as soon as they leave, the police pull up an armored truck and immediately break a hole in his wall and just tear up his entire backyard and start trying to destroy the shed. Like, what kind of operating procedure is that? You think there's a guy in a shed, so you spend like 2 hours destroying everything on your way to the shed. And eventually they tear it open and lo and behold, it's just a shed. And then that old couple's son found them wandering around the neighborhood at 7 p.m. that night. Like, what a just mean thing to do. Also, to continue the police's weirdness, whenever they thought there was a third gunman, they decided to have a low-flying helicopter fly over the neighborhood and loudly announce from the megaphone to give up because your accomplices have been captured. Imagine if you were just at home and didn't know what was going on. And then you walk outside to a helicopter 20 feet over your head telling you to surrender. Now, there's a couple mysteries to this case that I think would make a good bow to the whole thing. One of them is the story I just mentioned, the story of Emil bleeding out for 56 minutes. One of the reasons that he was allowed to bleed for 56 minutes is because there was a lockdown on the area, so anyone who wasn't police was not allowed in or out. While several medics who were closer to the bank decided to break that rule in order to help people, at one point they even commandeered an armored vehicle and began driving around the front of the bank picking up people who needed aid, which is pretty cool. But 2 medics decided to break rank and go to the area where Emil was shot. Initially, the medics were treating the guy who had glass in his face because he was the one driving the Jeep whenever Emil shot at him. A quick funny story about that guy. After he got out of the Jeep, he ran to the first house that was near him and began banging on the door and asking the person inside to let him in. However, the person who was inside was a 60-year-old lady who turned to her front door and saw a man with blood all over his face banging on it and called the police that there was a madman outside. Whenever the 2 medics arrived, they saw Emil laying down next to the car and he wasn't moving, so the medics just thought that guy was dead. However, as they were treating the driver, who they said had minor wounds because it was just glass tearing at his face, they saw Emil move, so the 2 medics immediately began to run towards him. As the medics were running towards them, a lieutenant stopped them and said, "What are you guys doing here? Don't you know there's another gunman nearby?" So the 2 of them got out of there thinking that they were in immediate danger. However, they remarked afterwards that this was weird because at this point all the cops had their gun holstered and were just casually standing around. That lieutenant would later say that a police sergeant ran up to them, said that there's more gunmen around the neighborhood, be careful, and then ran away. This magical running officer was never identified and an order like this was never given. And also, if it was, they would tell them over the working radio, not have a cop run by himself down a street that's supposedly infested with robbers. Also, it seems that those 2 medics had their report fabricated, because whenever they pulled those medics' reports later, it was written down that the medics said they had decided to treat the guy who had the glass hit his face and all that because he was in critical condition. However, as the medic said that day, the dude was pretty fine. He just had some cuts across his face. And the police used that to justify why Emil was not given aid. The children of Emil would later sue the police department for wrongful death. Also, it was very clear that the family knew everything he was up to. It wasn't like this was a surprise for them. So people saw it as being pretty cheap. The trial ended in a mistrial and was never really picked up. Again, it was a pretty unpopular decision to have the trial in the first place. But it's still a mystery to this day how much was fabricated and for what reason. The other mystery is about Emil's electrician business. Yeah, we're going all the way back to the beginning. So Emil started this electrician business in the late 80s. Whenever he started this business, he had a projected profit of about $150,000 to $250,000. In the early 90s, he reported his income as being closer to $2 million. Now, normally, this would be perfectly normal. It's not uncommon for a business with several employees in Hollywood to be making about $2 million a year. However, when the police were investigating all of their assets after they were dead, they went to this business location and it was an abandoned building. The electrician company was being used as a front with a reported income of, again, $2 million. So it seems that they were using Emil's business in order to launder their money. Now, the reason this ties back into the mystery is because the North Hollywood shootout took place in 1997, and the earliest supposed robbery that the 2 had committed was in 1993. So then, why in 1992 was an abandoned business making $2 million? This could mean that the 2 were committing several other crimes previously to the one suspected, and potentially other bank robberies. So these 2 may be responsible for far more crimes than what is currently believed. Also, these 2 each had their wives in on it, helping them launder the money, and they were renting several properties under false aliases across LA and it seems living rather lavish lifestyles with having cars separated in different parts of the city. So it was like Breaking Bad, but with banks instead of meth. He just like me, for real. The police investigated all of these properties and eventually found one that had a makeshift bomb making site in it, as well as several other rifles and ammunition. It's not known where these two got their weapons. Again, they were felons, so they couldn't have purchased them, but it does seem they did the illegal conversions in-house. Also, there was a push in government at the time to allow officers to more strongly arm themselves, because there were concerns that police could be confronted with a force that was more heavily armed than them, which is exactly what happened. So while it wasn't the only cause of it, the North Hollywood shootout was definitely the catalyst that made it to where police officers began arming themselves with semi-automatic rifles, with several people even pushing the idea of the modern militarized police force back to this event as its beginning.
And which is really, in some ways, a good idea. Because if something like this were to happen again, our police would really be SOL. And I know there's a lot of people against the police. Trust me, the handful that are assholes, there's a lot more that are good ones. So, man, this is just such a crazy story. And I remember watching it that day and just being flabbergasted. This is no Mandela effect, but I could have swore I remember seeing one of the guys being taken down from a headshot once they started getting more high caliber weapons brought in there. But I could be wrong. I haven't seen the entire, all the clips for quite a while. So, hope you guys enjoyed part 2. Sorry I was gone for most of it. I had recorded part 2, added, did my reactions, and for some reason, OBS would not stop recording. It would tell me it's not recording, and then it wouldn't let me upload it. So I don't know what the heck happened. So I apologize about that. But hopefully this one will work just fine. And I definitely appreciate you guys watching and watching me cover this new content creator new to my channel, featuring him from, like I said, from a recommendation. So if you guys have any recommendations, by all means, please feel free to let me know in the comments. Appreciate you guys stopping by, and yeah, hope you guys have a wonderful Monday. If I don't release any more videos tonight, if you don't see me, then peace. Hope you guys have a wonderful one.